Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 6 of The Last of the Jedi Secret Weapon. So, pretty much everyone except Orion, Reyna and Toma, obviously, have gone over to the, little, what was it, spaceport at, Oman, O-O-M-M-A-N, and, of course, they've gone there because they've learned to go to little space stations in tiny corners of the galaxy, where Imperial control isn't so great. And we're told how the Empire hasn't perfected its check-in systems, and the controls were difficult to maintain with the amount of people and vehicles coming in. But Trevor has no doubt they'll perfect it at some point. Their fake ID docs get them through and they go over to a cantina, and Trevor is absolutely amazed at Flame, as when you last saw her she was all dirty in coveralls, her face was burned and stuff, and now she's dressed in all white, her hair's coiled back, and it's a very big contrast, and she looks fine, and but I assume she looks fine, but now she just looks completely different, and she says, "Have a seat and introduce me to your friends," and Trevor introduces everyone, and Clive looks at Flame quite in puzzlement for a little bit, and he says, "I think we've met before," and Flame gives him a cool look and says, "Is that your standard line?" and Clive says, "I hope I'm not that uninspired," and Sola snorts, and Flame says she wouldn't know. Clive gets the and Clive understands that her frosty tone says she's not in the mood for banter. And Trevor explains that Roan is one of the founding members of the 11, and Doan is a member of the resistance of the 11. Well, of the 11 as well, I guess. He just says resistance, but we all know he's talking about the 11. And he says they're coming with them to Belasa, and Flame asks if they have an entry point, and Trevor suggests that they go to the mountains and take some air speeders into Usa, which is actually, that's how Obi-Wan and Ferrus got back to Usa in, if you remember back in a Desperate Mission when they were escaping Boba Fett and Harlan. So that was quite a nice little reference, indirect reference of course, but a nice little reference nonetheless. But Jonah shoots that down and says that used to be a possible route, but it's not anymore because the Empire is patrolling all throughout the mountains now. And she says, thick as yarrow few flowers in spring. And Rowan says he has a way, but it will be have to take some tricky piloting. And he says that the Empire has shut down Usa, and he says, but it's difficult to maintain patrols in the forested area south of the city. And Flame is absolutely baffled at that. She goes, "The Tangled Woods? That place is unnavigable." That's a very weird word, unnavigable. Unnavigable, not E. Unnavigable, unnavigable. It's such a fun, for some reason that's such a funny word, unnavigable. It doesn't. You can't take that word seriously, at least I can't. And Rowan says that there is a way, it's not unnavigable. And Flame asks about the rest of them, and they say they're going over to they're taking a spice liner. Astrid says they're taking a space liner to Coruscant. And Clive asks if they've got any advice, and Flame shakes her head and just says they got tight controls on all entry points, and their ID docs have to be perfect. And Clive asks if she has a favourite landing spot, and Flame just says that she's never been to Coruscant, not even before the Clone Wars, and that she just doesn't like crowded planets, so she can't help them there. And Sola says that she's off, and that says that they're off, and the space liner's boarding. And Trevor says we'll do the pre-flight checks with Flame, and this is the moment of parting, as it says, and Trevor is filled with foreboding all of a sudden, and it says parting friends were so different now. He didn't know when he'd see them again, if he'd ever see them again. And that's when Solace, in a pretty gruff tone, says, "Current Canadian told me that the Severeni never say goodbye. They just say the journey begins, so go." Which I completely forgot about that as well. How that was bad luck in their culture, but that was back in what was it, Underworld? Yeah, it was back in Underworld when what was it? When Ferris went with Solace and Trevor back into the temple, if you remember. And everyone starts, and Trevor says, "So go" to them, and Clive says, "So go, kids." And then you have Loon who shouts, "So go, Trevor!" And everyone laughs. And Astrid, Loon and Solace head to the departure gate, and Roan and Dona go with Trevor and Flume to the private vehicle departure hangar. And Flame gets at the... did I say Flume? No, I meant Flame, sorry. And Flame takes the controls, and Roan's a bit cautious, but Trevor reassures him that she's a great pilot and that he trusts her. And Roan dismisses it with a waved hand and says, "Carry on and you'll block the route," as he settles at the nav computer. And they start leaving, and we're told that they don't speak much on the way to Belasa. There's just too much uncertainty and danger. That made it just hard to think of anything else. And Trevor starts wondering about Ferris again. And he starts thinking about if he substituted him with for Flame, because it definitely seemed like that. It says, "It seems so strange now, as if he'd substituted Flame for Ferris. Events came rushing at him like a jump into hyperspace, and you didn't have time to think anything through." It was reassuring to be with Roan, at least, someone he knew and trusted, someone who connected him to his past. And now he was flying right into it. We're told it's a long day's journey, and eventually Roan quietly tells them that they're approaching Belasta in airspace, and we're told they're going to enter the planet's atmosphere well away from Usa from the south, over the wastelands on the other side of the planet. Then they will come up from the south. And that's when alarms start ringing through the ship. And Roan says that Imperial ships ringing the docking stations, evasive action. And that's where we end off the chapter. Not really a whole lot to talk about. It's interesting that Clive somewhat recognised Flame. That's quite interesting. I wonder if we're going to have a moment later on in the book where he finally recognises where he saw her from. That's, again, I keep bringing it up, the spy stuff. It wouldn't surprise me if that's where Clive knows her from. So, yeah, it's quite interesting that he recognised Flame, but Flame didn't recognise him. So, could that have been from his time as a double agent during the Clone Wars? That's food for thought. Of course, we got Trevor, and he's gets that sense of foreboding, and I think we've kind of come to learn in this series of books that when a character gets a sense of foreboding, something bad happens in a story. Most notably in my last book, You know, Ferris had a sense of foreboding about sending Trevor with Flame and the Russian delegation, and then Order 37 was something like that was happened on Rosha. So yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see where, again, all of this is headed. Not really a whole lot to talk about with this chapter, is there, really? So, yeah. I don't really have anything else to say, really. I may just have to end the review here. So, yeah. What else? Is there anything else I can say? Not really. And it's not really... Again, this is just a lot of just setting the characters into position for everything. So, yeah, I don't really have anything else to say. Oh, it will be interesting to see how Ferris finds Trevor again, and also what their interaction will be, but I think I've always brought that up, you know. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello, I have just read Chapter 7 of The Last of the Jedi Secret Weapon. So, one thing this book has really been doing well is just really making you feel hopelessness. And the end of this chapter really made that, but for now, let's continue on where we left off. So, of course, they've been caught... They've alerted Imperial docking stations, and so how do they get out of it? What's the solution? They just get out of the radar distance. And Rowan says that they're now out of range, but they're going to have to go back in again if they want to land. And he says that usually the patrols are centered and more random and are centered around Usa, and they never usually have large Star Destroyers lurking out towards the south before. And Flame asks what do they do as she turns around and lowers speed, and this is where the book gets a little bit confusing for me, because it just feels like it's one of those moments where it makes sense in the writer's head at the time, but it does not make sense once you go back and read it, and it's what is this? What's the gibberish here? And Rowan says he's got a large, and at first it's okay, you know. It says Rowan says he's got a large freighter clear to land at the user spaceport, and he says it's got to come in from the south, and if Flame could hug its flank, they might pass through the detection scan, then peel off when they're close to the surface. Which, you know, that sounds reasonable. But all of a sudden, the freighter just comes out of nowhere. And Flame turns the ship and starts getting as close as it can to the stern of the freighter, and the freighter blasts its exhaust, and Flame's struggling to keep control of the ship, and eventually they get through. And it's like, where did the freighter come from? You know, where did the freighter come from? Who's manning the freighter? It's like, it is just one of those things where it's like, this is what makes sense in the writer's head at the time, but it doesn't make sense when you go back and look at it, read it, and it does feel a bit like, you know. But somehow they get through with that. Again, I don't quite know how specifically, like, how the phaser got there so quickly. Unless it was already, like, flying around or something. But they dive back down toward the surface, and they're now beyond the sensors, and Rowan says there's no sign that they've seen us, and he thinks they made it past the checkpoint. And they make their way to the Tangle Woods, and we're told about how towering and intertwining and thick the trees are, and how their roots have a complex system underground. And as flames flying through them, she says, "This is impossible." Rowan tells her that it only seems so, and he says, "Trust me, follow the coordinates I laid out, don't trust your eyes." Flame says, "Okay." She's a bit shaky, and they're flying straight towards the branch, and Trevor shrinks back in his seat, but they wind up flying straight through the branch and wind up going into a windy kind of tree tunnel, I assume. Rowan explains that that the Umbelasum resistance works for weeks to get this set up. And it's a safe pathway to USA, and the Empire hasn't discovered it yet, and they hope they won't. They never will. Flame goes through the tunnel, and then Rowan says that they can leave the ship at the edge of the wood, and that it's a short hike to USA. And Flame lands down in a clearing, and Rowan says that they can't take survival packs because they need to look like they're residents of the city, not people who aren't from the city. And so they start walking through the forest, and eventually they can make out lights in the distance, and eventually they hear the hum and whoosh of the air traffic, and that's when they know they're close, and and it says they walk parallel to the main road. Rowan says that there's an Airbus up ahead, and Rowan says Donor and him will bring Flame's credentials to the 11, and then they'll contact Flame when there's word. And he asks if Trevor's coming with them, and Trevor says he'll stay with Flame. And Rowan nods, and Trevor also says that he's got some buddies in the black market who are gonna hide them. Rowan nods and wishes them good luck, and he says that he and Donor will continue on foot. And so Trevor and Flame make their way to the Airbus. It starts raining, and Trevor starts thinking, "I'm home." It's on page 49, that says, but it just says, "I'm home." Trevor thought. It's typically the usual spelling for Trevor. O-R, not E-R. So that was quite interesting. Now there was another... There's been quite a lot of spelling mistakes in these books. I've come across quite a lot of them. There was Padmai, I think, in Underworld. I'm fairly sure it was Underworld. I'm fairly sure there was... And then there's been quite a few others as well throughout the books. But anyway, the Airbus takes them throughout the city, and we're reminded about how Outlanders can often get lost in USA, since it was a city built around 7 lakes, and the roads were circular and twisted around each other in what's described as dizzying arcs. And they eventually reach the Moonstone district, and they get off. Flame says there's not much to see around here, and Trevor explains they like it that way, and we're told Trevor got Flame off 2 stops away from their destination, just to be sure the approach was safe. And he leads Flame through the dark streets and down an alley, and they move into a warehouse which seems to be made into a makeshift city. And as Trevor walks in, it's like the base for all the black marketers, etc. And as Trevor walks in, everyone looks over to him. And we have what's described as a tall, muscled man with a heavy beard and a chest holstered with small but deadly vibro shivs stood up. Flame tensed. The menacing man threw open his arms. "We thought you were dead," he bellowed. "Come here, you black-hearted scamp weasel." And he picks Trevor up in what's described as a bear hug. And he puts Trevor down, and he says he's glad to see him too. And the man's name is Pator. And he hands Flame and Trevor a tarp, and they go and relax down. And we're told that Pator was the one who watched out for Trevor. when he first started living on the street, and Flame says, seems like a good guy to have watching your back, and Trevor said, sure helped the transition, which again, knowing about Trevor's past, that is, it's sweet to know he had someone looking out for him. And there's a large hollow screen in there. Pator explains that the Empire's hollow vision is the only thing they can get on the hollow net. They can get on Balasa now, and he says, still, they promised to broadcast some archives of the Galactic Games tonight. No good for something, I guess. And that's when Darth Vader appears on the screen, and the commentator starts talking about how Vader's the Imperial liaison for the Belasan drive to convert all factories to productive ends. We're already aware of this. And he says the crash of the Belasan economy has been a personal concern of the Emperor. And it says that he's been gathered gathered the best and brightest of human scientists in the galaxy, and you have a Dornine say, what's the matter with the rest of us? And Flame says that the Empire don't like other species, and they're starting to fill all staff positions of humans. And that's when Trevor freezes and sees Ferrus, and the room goes completely silent. It talks about how the Empire's called upon Belasan hero Ferrus Solon for assistance, and now Ferrus has pledged considerable energies to the task of retooling the Belasan factories and bringing new life to the planet's economy, and the room just bursts out with boos and jeers, as it said, and not cheers, jeers, not Jeer, and everyone's frustrated and angry and calling Ferrus a traitor. And Flame is surprised at how the black marketers and thieves are rising up at this, and says that she wouldn't have expected them to be so into politics, and Trevor says everyone on Belarus care about politics. And Trevor feels the contempt in the room, and it says, betrayal. How could Ferrus do this, even as a double agent? He had been an inspiration. Now he was the worst of the worst. A traitor. It's going to be so interesting, so interesting to see what Trevor will say to Ferrus if they meet again. I assume they'll meet again. We've got 3 more books to go. Like, come on, they're probably going to meet again. But it's going to be so interesting to see what they say to each other, I have no idea. You can just see Ferrus being so apologetic to Ferrus to Trevor, and Trevor just being so angry at Ferrus. I assume that's probably how it's going to go, depending on the circumstances, of course. Like, if it's anything like the last book where they meet when Trevor was harming the Resistance, it may be a bit of a different story, but yeah. Poor Trevor's really not having a good time, is he? Again, the freight a bit. It's like, what? What happened? It just doesn't make sense, because it's just like the freighter comes out of nowhere, and we jump straight into using the freighter to get past the sensors, and it's a bit like, what's going on here, It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it's just the freighter appears out of nowhere, and it's like, who's piloting the freighter? It's just... It brings up so many questions, and it's like, what's going on here? And it is a bit, it just, again, it just doesn't make sense. But it is what it is. What else can I say? Again, I find it interesting that Trevor hasn't expressed his doubts about Ferris to Roan. You know, Roan is of course Ferris's partner. So it's interesting that he hasn't brought anything of that up to Roan. You know, I think out of all the people, Roan will probably be the one that Trevor would want to bring that up to, and I find it interesting that it was Solace he brought it up to as well. You know, of course Solace was the one who realised Trevor was hiding something, but you would think at some point Trevor would have brought it up to Roan by this point. You know. And so it's going to be, so I find that quite interesting, and it's also going to be interesting to see what Roan's reaction is to seeing Ferris on helping the Empire. You know, it really just feels like everything is falling apart for Ferris since he's becoming a double agent. You know, it feels like he may as well have just taken his amnesty and not help and works to free Roan and Donor, and things probably would have turned out better, you know, or have went with the whole with the crew at the end of a tangled web, and things would have been better, you know. So it really that's the great thing about this book. It really feels like there's a lot of hopelessness going on in here. You know, you really feel how Ferris feels hopelessness. And again, Trevor is a great point of view for the average person in the galaxy, you know. And that's one of the guys I bought up quite a few books ago, I think back in Underworld, how Trevor is such a great point of view for the reader to see into what it's like as a normal person in the galaxy, for the most part. Normal. And you really kind of get to see how Ferris looks in the eyes of Trevor, you know. How Trevor also is slightly biased, but not completely biased. You know, he still is in disbelief. You know, and I think that's one of the great things about, I think, Trevor's character. He acts not just as a point of view for the audience, he also acts as a point of view for the audience into the people of the galaxy. You get to see what the galaxy looks like from a normal person's perspective, rather than always being through like the Jedi or a bounty hunter or a Sith, or you know. So yeah, I think that brings an end to this review. I don't really have a whole lot else to say. I know the next chapter is on Coruscant in the Orange District, so we're going to be focusing on Astri, Clive, Loon, and Solace. For some reason her name escaped me. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone. So I've just read chapter 8 of The Last of the Jedi's Secret Weapon. So we're back on Coruscant, and everything just seems to be more in the Orange District. It says that it seems to contain more lowlives, more menace, more debris, and it seems more dangerous, more seedy, and goes more, and then it cuts to Clive saying, "Orange?" And he says it's been a while since he's been here, but he never remembered, but it was never this orange. And Solace tells them that the Empire has left it alone, so it's just gotten worse, because again we're told, if you remember in Underworld, we were told that the Senate kept trying to replace the lights, but they kept somehow switching all of them back to the orange ones, and so they just gave up. And again, Solace says the Empire has left it alone, so it's just gotten worse. Left the district alone. And Astri says thinks that that's good, and she's holding Moon's hand, and she's been holding his hand since they got off the air taxi. And Solace says yes and no, but they won't leave the Orange District alone for long. They don't want to be seen as weak. So, and she says that Ferris told us that their ambition is to control Coruscant all the way down to the course. If that's their ambition, they'll follow through. And Astrid starts to have doubts about being on Coruscant. And Solace says that no, it is the best place, and she says that Dex has a good setup, and an asteroid was no place for Loon to be. And she says that Dex has. So she says he has his ear to the ground, and and if they need to move, he'll know when it's time to move. And he'll be ready. And Astrid and Clive were a bit taken off guard because it seemed very out of character for Solace to have any concern for Loon or a child. And Astrid hasn't even been sure Solace remembered Loon's name. But then they also have a bit of some doubts as to maybe if Solace only cares about him because he was a Force adept. Clive grins at Astrid, and she ducks her head away before Clive can see her answering smile, and Astrid's still trying to figure out if she likes Clive. As Trevor told him that Clive had been a con man before the Clone Wars, and despite all of his boasts about being an industrial spy for the good guys, whoever they were. And Astrid does think that she's also been on the other side of the law as well, as a slicer. But she's of course been winning from Bog Divinian, and be reminded a bit about how the last thing she needs is a smooth talking charlatan. And Bog Divinian was exactly that. And all Bog cared about was climbing the ladder to political power. And we were told that once he got a taste of success, he did anything to keep it. And it says he prided himself on loyalty, but basically that meant others had to be loyal to him. And we told how he failed at every business he tried, but he was a master of politics, and he had exceeded anyone's expectations, including Astrid's, and it infuriates Astrid that Bog had turned out to have the last laugh. And it says she couldn't believe what a dope she had been, as in stupid person. And how her father Didi, or is it Didi? Because it's D-I-D-I. This is this is the thing with Star Wars, you can never quite tell if a normal name's meant to be pronounced the normal way. And it's on that her father had tried to warn her, and then she feels a longing for her father, and she starts to tear up a bit, and how her father had been it's described he was an unscrupulous liar, a delightful person, and a wonderful father. And we talked how he ran schemes behind her back usually, and how he'd been a gambler and it says with a loose connection to the truth, who'd won his business, a cafe in a game of sabacc. And they get to Dex's alley, and then they make their way through, and Astrid brings Loon closer, and she has to admit that, and she admits to herself that Loon had basically made Astrid a coward because she wanted to protect herself and not risk her life for Loon. In her mind, her life is Loon's life. And they make their way through the alley, and eventually they make their way to a door. And Astrid gets a bit of a bad feeling. She wonders if they're coming into a trap. And as they walk towards the stairs, Dex appears at the top and goes, "Welcome, welcome!" And he says hello to each of them. He says it's good to see Solace. He says Clive Flax, he may not remember me, we met before. And Clive says he does remember, and he's still digesting his sliders. And Dex chortles and says they stick to your ribs, that's for certain. And then he sees Astrid and he says that she's prettier than ever, and he remembers when he bought the diner from her father, so he was the one who won it. He says he heard of his passing and he's sorrier than he can say, and that he says he was a good man, and he says you must miss him dearly, and Astrid says with a smile that she does. And Dex laughs again, and he says, "Let me, I got business, I changed a few things, but everyone who came in still asks for you and Didi." And Astrid thanks Dex for taking them in, and he looks over at Loon, and Loon introduces himself, and Dex says, so it is, he says, "I'm Dexter, you can call me Dex like everyone else does. You may not remember, but we also met before, you were only 2 years old." Loon says, "I remember very well," which again, kind of a hint of his force sensitivity. And Dex laughs and says, "So he does." And he says, "Let's get the tykes something to eat, and we can, and the rest of us will talk, there's much to say." And WA7 has escaped. Woo! Well, Flo. Flo's her name. I didn't realise that, but that Flo is the WA7's name. WA7's the model of droid, not the name of the character. But, well, okay, the character can be... It's also known as WA7, but you know what I mean. And she takes Loon over to the kitchen for something to eat, and Solace and Dex brings Solace, Clive, and Astrid over to Keats and Cohen. Which, hooray, Keats! You know I like Keats. You know, if you've been watching these reviews, you know I like Keats. He's very quickly become one of my favourite characters in Star Wars. But Solace tells where the others were and how they had to and the fact that they had to smuggle Astrid and Loon from Samaria. And Cohen says that they can stay here as long as they like and it's safe for now. And Dex says that they should be on the lookout for planets where they can lie low, and they should choose carefully because Bogdavidian's now not only the governor of not only the ruler of Samaria, but also he's the ruler of Rosha, of the entire Mertu system, given there's only 2 planets in that system. So he says that he has a lot of... He's the governor of a system now, and that's very important, and how he has lots of connections, so Astrid and Loon should be careful at where they choose to go. And Astrid nods, and Dex then looks over to Clive and Solace and tells them he has something to tell them. And this is the bit that got me a little bit, because it was, from my familiarity with the character. And he starts talking about the new head Inquisitor, Hydra. Now the thing is, I have made it clear, Wikipedia has said that Hydra was female. Looking at its talk pages, it definitely seems like the page has in the past refers to Hydra as male, he, him. And it later was changed to she, her. But Dex refers to Hydra here as he, him. So that's confused me a bit. Because on Wikipedia it was formerly he, him, then changed to she, her. Now it could still be she, her. I'm not ruling that out just yet, because the thing is, we assume pronouns. When we don't know someone properly, we assume pronouns, and so I assume that's probably what's going on here. But we'll have to see until next book when Hydra finally appears, because she doesn't appear in this book, or he doesn't appear. So we'll see until what it is next book. Or if it gets if it's figured out later in this book. But anyway, Dex explains that Hydra was the former assistant of Malorum, and he says that Hydra is the new head Inquisitor, and Hydra's taken over from Malorum. He was he was his former assistant, and he looks like to have some of the same interests as Valorum, and that he's investigating a human male with unusual powers who keeps popping up and disappearing. And Solus goes, unusual powers? And Dex explains that this person with unusual powers has been seen in key areas of the Empire, and has made some trouble for them. And he says, I guess, and made some trouble for them, I guess, and they want him bad. We don't know why exactly. Thing is, these special powers sound a lot like using the Force to me. I thought you should know that. And Keats says our contact is trying to find out more information, but everyone likes to keep their heads down these days. Things are locked down tight. I'm sorry to say that Cullen and I worked every connection we have and came up dry. So again, you know, they've tried to learn more, but they can't really get more. And Dex says, so let's stick with what they know, and he says the order has came from high above, maybe even as high as Vader, to trap this unusual power fellow, and bring him in for questioning. And he says the last sighting was right here on Coruscant. And Solus asks if he thinks he's a Jedi, and Dex says he could be. He thinks he could be, but Ferris ought to know. And Solus frowns and explains that he's in deep cover and they can't get the information to him, and she'll have to check it out herself. And Clive says he'll give a hand, and he owes Ferris a few favours, but not to tell him that. And but he owes Ferris a few favours, sorry. And Astrid hesitates, because she's vowed to herself that she's to lay low on here on Coruscant, and she can't risk exposure. She has to protect Loon, but Ferris also rescued her. He protected her, and she knows he would do it again and again. And she thinks it's time to find her courage. And she says she'll help, they might need a good slicer. And Dex tilts his head at her and says, you came here for a place to hide, not to get involved. And as she says that, Ferris helped her. And she's always been ready to help the Jedi. And Clive says to Keats and Curran that he still has some contacts. And he says if yours have run dry, he might be able to dig something up. And Solus says that she can still work from some angles, because again, you got to remember that she was being looked at quite a bit, if you remember. She was wanted quite a bit, and she probably still is. And Keats asks what he and Curran can do, and Dex looks at them and he says, oh, I have the perfect job for the two of you, he says, and that's where the chapter ends off. Why do I have the feeling that Dex is going to put them in some sort of job where he gets them out of his sight because they keep driving him mad? You know, that feels like something that's about to happen. For the most part, I'm not sure if I have a whole lot to say on this chapter. You really kind of get to we get to sympathise quite a bit with Astrid. You know, she really just wants to protect her son. She just wants the best for her son. And it's tough to do that, you know, especially since Bog has so much influence. They need to be really careful where they're going and who they talk to, you know. So yeah, but you also learn, well, at least I learned a little bit about her father. You know, I'm not sure if this is information that was already explained in Jedi Quest, that Dex won the diner from her father. I don't know if that's the case. I've made it very clear I've not read Jedi Quest. But the thing is, Last of the Jedi, it does a really good job at catching you up with Jedi Quest if you haven't read it. So, yeah, I think I think Last of the Jedi is definitely a book you can suggest to a Star Wars fan and say that while it would benefit to read while it would benefit to read Jedi Quest first, you don't have to read it. You still get a full enough image just by reading these books, and I think that's, I'm for the most part fully understanding what's going on. What else is there? Yeah, it was a bit odd that sort of said that Lune needs to be kept safe, but also that didn't really. But also, car went over my head until Astrid and Clive looked at each other and was like, "Hey, where's this come from?" It 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 it, it did feel a bit. Once you start to think about it, because again, Solace is such a serious character, but also, she keeps forwarding certain things, but it's not something I wouldn't see beyond her. I would say that's actually feels quite a bit in character for her, because she definitely is helping Ferris quite a lot, This is something that I think she knows Ferris would help with this, and she's doing it because I think Ferris would help with it. So yeah. What else is there? Again, Hydra. That really confused me. With the he/him pronouns. Again, it's something where I have to wait and see until next book to actually see what that is, because it really just is what's going on here, Again, I assume it's just assumed pronouns rather than the actual pronouns for Hydra, but we'll have to wait and see, we'll have to wait and see. So yeah. I guess that really brings an end to this review. I don't really have anything else to say on it. So, yeah. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 9 of The Last of the Jedi Secret Weapon. I didn't realise I'm almost halfway through the book. So we're focusing on Roan and Dona on Balasa, and they're making their way through the streets. Ferris keeps telling himself that it's good to be home, and it's good to have his boots on his own world. He keeps telling himself that, but he knows he's searching for something to make himself feel better, just one thing. And because all around him, he can sense that, but Usa, the city of Usa, is just falling apart, it's crumbling. In his beloved city is crumbling, and the city had gone through a war and an occupation, and still found the will and ability to resist the last citizen, and now it's fallen to its knees. How it's fallen to its knees, you can feel it. And there's a saying on Balasa, as goes Usa, so goes Balasa, and it says that was the saying on his own world, and everyone always look to Usa for pretty much everything, trends, signs, direction, courage. Roan can see it's dying, and it says that he feels displaced, as if like the gravity of the planet had changed, or as if the thin air from the mountains had gone down to Usa, and was invading the city slowly, until every citizen felt a bit short of breath and a little dizzy. He wonders if he's losing his nerve, and he starts to wish he could see Ferris again. And retards how his partnership with Ferris grounded him, and that Ferris is playing a dangerous game, and he fears for the future for the first time. They're walking through the streets, and they are struggling to find any place to have something to eat, They've been to 3 diners, Um, there's individual ingredients to make stuff, but there's never enough ingredients to make the thing, you know. You have the ingredients, but not all the ingredients. And eventually they find a kind Houston who set up a stand near the park with dry fruit and flatbread, and she's almost sold out, but she gives some to Roan and Donor. And they go and sit down and start eating. And Donor says that when people get hungry, resistance can fade. And Roan wonders how much longer they can hold out with winter coming, and he says if they recognise the governor, if they agree to recognise the governor and obey the laws of the Empire, the blockade will lift. And Donor says that soon mothers will see their children crying, and do they want to sacrifice their children? And we're reminded about how the Empire has strictly regulated the spaceport, and how it's closed theatres, museums, entertainment complexes, and they had usually given the city such vibrant life, and now they put black Imperial garrisons in the green parks. And as it says, he had taken away all the things that made life worth living, except life itself. And Donna there tells Roan she's not going back to the mountains, and this surprises Roan because the mountains are sacred to Donor. And he asks why, and Donor says she's staying here to help the 11, and that's just by offering the occasional help, like with sanctuary now and again, or guides when they need them, but proper help. And Roan tries to counter-argument to say, but you do help. They need contacts in the mountains, and that's becoming more important than ever. And Donor gets a bit impatient and says, you have other contacts in the mountains and you know it. You have other agents there, and good ones. And she says, I'm an old woman. Is that it? You think I can't be helpful? Then Roan laughs and says, I don't think of you as an old woman, Donor. I know you'll be helpful. He says, Donor finishes the sentence for him saying, want to protect me? And Roan admits to it and says yes. And Donor says that he and Ferris have done enough, and that she owes them her life, and she owes her home world. And she says, here's the thing you might not realise. No one looks at an old woman. I can do more for you than you think. And Roan says, all right, we're honoured that you'll stay. And Roan just says he doesn't want to lose Donor. And Donor says, you and me, we're too tough for them to catch. And Roan says, truth be told, he was glad. Donor was a link to Ferris before the Clone Wars. They had visited her in the mountains and stayed in her cabin. It was among their happiest times. And we talked about how Roan had grown up in USA, with a large extended family, and how he's used to all the noise and movement and laughter, and how his parents and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles are still sprinkled about the city, but he very rarely visits his parents or any of them in case he endangers them. We're told how his sister had been killed in the Clone Wars, how his brothers had emigrated to other planets, but he could walk down any street and it would make him smile with a happy memory. And Donor says to Roan that she saw Ferris on the HoloNet last night, and she says he's acting the part of the traitor very well. Too well. Roan asks if she thinks that she is and betray the resistance and join the Empire. And he doesn't think he could bear it if Donor thought that. And I like that Roan's also got a little bit of that doubt in him. He definitely has a lot less doubt than Trevor. You know, he has a lot less doubt. But he still has a little bit of that doubt inside him. But Donor says that she doesn't think he's turned. But he's worried that what the good he thinks he's doing will be outweighed by the bad. And because he was a symbol of hope to the people of USA, and now he's bowing down to power, and it looks like he's given up. So why shouldn't the Usans follow in what his presumed footsteps? And Roan says to come on, let's walk, because you can't linger anywhere too long in case of spies. Rowan says, you may be right, and if I know Ferris, he's thinking the same thing. There has to be a reason he's remaining. And Zona agrees and says he's right, and Rowan wishes he can talk to him. And Zona says that the people of USA are ready to give in, and even in their short time here, she's heard rumblings, and says if the Empire takes over the factories and builds more, there will be plenty of new jobs, people want to feed their families, and Rowan says that's what they're counting on. And Dona says, yes, well, you can't eat integrity, only bread. And they walk down a route and get to a little house, and they slip in, and Amy Anton is in there, Dr. Amy Anton, or Amy Anton. I think Amy Anton just rolls off better, you know. Again, Star Wars, it's tough to know how you pronounce these names. And she's glad to see Rowan, and she says that they didn't know what happened to them, and when he contacted them, they were so happy. And she hugs Rowan and then hugs Stoner, who's a bit startled because she barely knows Amy. And Amy dabs her eyes and then brings them over to Will. And we learn that he's got an injured foot. And Will explains that he was down by the garrison undercover trying to monitor comings and goings, as he can pick up a surprising amount of information. And he was challenged by a sentry, and he decided to run, and he got a shot off on him. And he says that Amy says he'll live. And Amy confirms it. And before Amy brings him in, she explains that as she's stabbing her eyes, she says, silly, I know, it's just that we've had our losses lately, Teris and Namer. And Rowan asks what happened, and she explains that they were shot down. They were the ones from earlier, and she says Darth Vader was aboard and Ferris was too. And Rowan just knows how much it must have hurt Ferris to just watch that and be helpless. But yeah, also Will's on a low couch with his foot up, which looks very strange because he's usually very energetic. And anyway, once Rowan says, I guess he didn't run fast enough after Will told the story of his little injured foot. Rowan says Dona wishes to join them, and Will says he's happy to hear it, and he says that Dona will be a valuable addition. And Rowan says she'll need new ID docs, they both will. And he says he can fabricate them, and he asks what shape their equipment is in, because he knows they're about to move headquarters. And Will says they've set up an ID fabrication here, but they're thinking about moving. They're thinking about moving every couple of weeks. They think it's best to do that. And they scatter the group, and they all keep moving. But the problem is, the Usans aren't as cooperative as they were a few months ago. Before, they were willing to make sacrifices, even if they weren't part of the 11, whether it was given equipment, apartments, or places to store things, or safe houses. But it's just slowed down, and Amy intervenes and says they're growing tired of sacrifice, and she says who can blame them? Our successes have boiled down to simply surviving. And she says there seems to be no end in sight, and the Empire just keeps getting stronger and more organised. And Moan says they can't give up, and Will agrees. And he says that they're going to need something big to win back the Usans. They're going to need to do something big, a big victory. Something that will give them hope back. But they're running out of options. They don't have the funds for the bribes or equipment. And Rowan says they may be able to help her hit them there. And Rowan explains who Flame is and what she's doing with Moonstrike, which again, the amount of times this has been covered, you know, if you've not gone through my Return of the Dark Side review, maybe go and read that. Maybe go and watch that, or if you haven't read the book yourself, maybe go read it. You know, it's just look, the amount of times Moonstrike has been explained, it's not really worth to keep explaining it over and over and over. And Will says that Moonstrike sounds like an idea. It sounds like an idea, but it may expose them too much, but they have wished to communicate with other worlds and share information, and there is strength in numbers. Amy says it's worth a meeting, and Rowan says that, and when she asks if Flame would come, Rowan says she's on Balasa just waiting for the signal. And she says she'd be willing to fund an operation for the 11. And Will says that let's have a meeting then, and Amy agrees. And Rowan starts to ask about Ferris, and he asks Amy and Will to be honest as they kind of glance down, and Will says they support what he's doing, and we support whatever he's doing, it's not that. And then Amy says, just does he have to be so visible? He's all over the hollow net. Rowan says he's sure they planned it that way and he's stuck and he has to keep his position. And when Amy asks why and if he's brought back any information they can use, Rowan just shakes his head. And of course he can't say why. He can't explain why finding Jedis are a higher priority to him, and he can find get into the Imperial stuff and find if they suspect any Jedi. You know, we can't explain that to him because it relies on secrecy. At least not yet. And Will says if they're wondering if the danger is Ferris is putting himself in is worth it. And he says he doesn't believe he's on the Empire, but many Balasans do. And Amy says that it should be worth it. And Rowan says he's sure it is, and he says he's sure Ferris is painfully aware of the image he's projecting, and he says in any case they should try to make contact with him while he's here. And try to find out what's really going on, because he says with factory business, what's really going on? It's never what they say it is. And Will add so it's rarely to their benefit. And Amy asks how they're going to get into contact with him because he's practically attached to Vader's hip, as she says, and Rowan promises that he has a way. And that's where we end off the chapter. You really get to kind of see, again, how it looks from a normal person's perspective on Balasa. You know, if Rowan is seeing how everyone's just losing hope, you know, they're tired of battle, they just want to get on with their lives, you know. And of course the 11 hasn't done much recently. They're not really doing much else aside from surviving, and they just and you know, they at this point they just want to continue on with life, you know. The Empire is of course promising that, and of course with Ferris, you know, he's a symbol of hope on Balasa, he's a hero, and so of course everyone's believing that he's actually with the Empire, and that this is their best choice for them. And again with Dona, we get to see how, you know, she doesn't think she's useful that much, and by just being in the mountains. And I like that she's getting a little bit. She's taking a bit more of a role. I like that she's taking a bit more of a role. I hadn't expected her to appear outside of the Desperate Mission, so it was pleasant when she appeared in a Tangle's Web, and it's extremely pleasant now that she's having a bit of a bigger role and taking a bit more of an authoritative stance, I suppose. So that it's quite nice that she's taking a bit of a bigger role. What else is there to talk about? I'm not sure if I have anything else to talk about. Again, I like how we get to see Rowan's stats. You know, even though he knows Ferris has his reasons for working for the Empire, you know, for working as a double agent, you see how, a bit like Trevor, he has a bit of that doubt. He doesn't have as much doubt as Trevor, not by a long shot, but he has a bit of doubt. He's wondering himself if Ferris has turned himself to the Empire. And you really do see how Dona's really reassuring with him, and how she doesn't believe it. And you see that brings him quite a bit of relief, you know. It's just he couldn't have bared it if Dona thought he had turned himself over. So it is nice that there is that moment of reassurance. And again, it's a shame that it wasn't really, that Rowan hasn't brought that reassurance to Trevor yet, you know. You would assume out of all the characters, Rowan would be the one to tell Trevor. No, he hasn't betrayed. He hasn't betrayed them. You know, you would think out of all the characters, Rowan would be the one to tell Trevor that, because, you know, he's literally Ferris's husband. It's never stated in the books, because of course, when these books were published, it wasn't... It was a bit complicated at the time, given Ferris was... Given Ferris and Rowan are gay, it was a bit complicated at the time, so it couldn't be properly established in the books. But Jules Watson later clarified in on the Twitter that yes, they were meant to be read as gay, and in her mind they were married, and so, you know, that's pretty much, you know, they are married, you know, they are partners, and so it feels like out of all the characters, wasn't Rowan be the one to reassure Trevor? I feel like that's just a bit like a why hasn't Trevor brought it up with Rowan, or Rowan brought it up with Trevor, you know? It just feels a bit like, hey. But, you know, it is what it is, you know. Maybe we'll get that later. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I don't know what I was going to say, really, there. But, you know, we're almost halfway through the book. Chapter 10's next. We're on page 70-something. Yeah, page 71's next. I've just read page 70. And there's 149 pages, so, and 21 chapters. So, you know, it's a bit shorter than, it's roughly, 20 or so pages shorter than the Desperate Mission. 18, 19, that was, that very short Desperate Mission was 167 pages. And I'm fairly sure this is 149 pages. So, you know, it's around about 18, 19 pages shorter. This has about an extra chapter than the Desperate Missions, so it's not too... it's, you know, it's not going to be as short as some as pretty much all the books after Desperate Mission, aside from this one, but it is going to be a bit longer. We're almost halfway through, so yeah. Do I have anything else? Oh, I do like how Amy Anton is a bit frustrated at how Trevor... Not Trevor, so why do I always get Ferris and Trevor mixed up when I'm talking about them? I do like I don't get them mixed up in my head when I'm writing about them, but you know, it's... Talking about them, for some reason I get them mixed up. It is nice how... not really nice, but it is interesting that Amy is so frustrated at Ferris being so conspicuous. I think that's the word, isn't it? Being too visible, of attracting attention, you know. And you really understand her frustration, you know. You understand it from each character's perspective. You understand it from Rowan and Dona's perspective, that this is something he has to do. And that his priority isn't the Resistance, but he's helping them when he can. His priority is finding Jedi. But he can't... But from Amy and Will's perspective, you know, he's certainly a double agent, and from their perspective, he's still meant to be helping the Resistance, you know. So it's interesting. So you understand it from both perspectives. But yeah, I think that brings an end to this review. So yeah, Thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello, I have just read chapter 10 of the Last of the Jedi Secret Weapon, and I am officially over halfway through the book. So we open up this chapter in pretty much Ferris's thoughts, and he's thinking about attachment and how if he wants to be a Jedi, he can't have. If he wants to be a true Jedi again, he can't have any. He's not supposed to. But he's thinking about what does it mean to have attachment, and it's something that puzzled him even as a Padawan, and we're told that he'd been attached to his master Siri, and how she'd been a mentor, a big sister, and a presence in his life that had protected him, and in her own way, she had cherished him. And he asked his master what it meant, by it to not be attached, and he says it seems so hard to have so many beings who are important to me, but not to be attached to them. I don't understand what is meant by no attachment. And Ferris remembers Siri's face, how there have been there has been a sequence of emotions, or as he says, a play. How she went from a soft look to then sad, and then an emotion all that emotion just went away. All what that was left was contemplation for a question that had no answer. She said to him, "It's not so hard to explain. To love without wanting to possess or influence. To cherish without keeping. To have without holding." Ferris remembers nodding, thinking he had gotten it, and as usual wanting to please Siri again. He wanted to be all perfect and stuff. And he says he understood. And Siri looked at him and smiled and says, "No, you don't understand. It's something to strive for." And here Ferris is on Ballasta now, and everything's reminding him of attachment because he's just so connected to Ballasta. It's literally his adopted home world. I think that was said in, what was it? It was either Desperate Mission, Dark Warning, or Underworld. I'm fairly sure it's Desperate Mission or Dark Warning though. But I know in one of those books it says that Ferris felt as if Ballasta was his adopted home world. I think it was Desperate Mission that said that. And he's thinking now how everything on Ballasta just reminds him of attachment. Attachment to his home world, attachment to Roan, attachment to his friends, and he just keeps bumping into memories pretty much wherever he looks. And he sees that the Jedi were right. His attachment is interfering with his connection to the Force and his concentration. And again, all he just wants to do is slip away with Roan and relax with him and be surrounded by his friends with the 11. This brings up something that I was thinking of throughout this chapter, which was what about when Obi-Wan said the future the Jedi probably won't need to resist attachment, and attachment will be a strength. And Ferris thinks about that, and he remembers how Obi-Wan had told him that because so much had changed, perhaps the rules of the Jedi would change, and perhaps attachment would be valued, and that it says they were up against a system that values nothing, least of all attachment. So maybe they needed to hold what they could. But Ferris can't let go of the attachment. He just can't. And he doesn't want to let them go. Not any of it. And he thinks that he'll have to find a way to make it all fit. Not in the abstract, but the particular, like a face that brings him joy, or familiar walk. Something he can find strength in and not weakness, as it says. And we are told how he didn't know how to be close to someone until Roan when he left the Jedi Order, until Roan had taught him that. And how his family had immediately just accepted him as one of them. And had accepted him without question, and now he thinks how he's betraying them, and now they're seeing him on the HoloNet, and he thinks that they were wondering how he could have betrayed them in such a way. And we're told that he hasn't been allowed to be left alone since he arrived. Vader's made sure of it. He's being dragged from meeting to meeting like an animal, and shown off like a trained animal. He's being constantly managed and escorted so we can't speak to a Larson directly, which on the Empire's part, that's smart, because we all know what Ferris will be doing, otherwise he will be telling them that I don't support this. No, that's what he would want to do anyway. And we're told that he could get away, but he just isn't sure if he should. He thinks he needs to let them do their work and present him as a traitor until he knows for sure what he's doing and where he's going. Again, you know, it's at the moment he's not learned much, has he? And even if he does escape, you know, it's like, what's he gonna do then, you know? And so he thinks that he'll continue to feel the agony of all of this and do nothing except wait. And he hopes to discover more about Twilight and what the Empire's actually doing on Balasa. As he knows something for sure, and he knows something's up. He doesn't know what's up, but he knows something's up. Then we have a bit of a cut, and we're told how they were about how the meeting was with engineers and scientists from planets all around the galaxy, all volunteering to retool views and factories and get their economy going again, or at least, as it says, that was the spin, which I assume is just meaning like that. That's what's been said. And Ferris, we learn he's been left out of the important meetings. The meetings where it says the real words are being said, and they trot him out for the benefits of the journalists and the native Banarsons. Again, it says he was present for the meetings in which platitudes were exchanged and promises made that had nothing to do with the real issues. And we're told that he's in one of the factories of Balasa, and we learn that these factories are pretty much in their own district, and the Balarsons prided their factories on their textiles and ceramics, and how their factories are clean and orderly. And we're told how they mix both advanced technology and good design. And how they're highly desired, and how all their textiles and ceramics are highly desired around the galaxy. And we're told that the factories aren't large, but there are many of them, and they usually were able to employ a sizable amount of the population before they went closed 6 months ago. Ferris is looking out the window to the garden, and he sees that the garden is actually surprisingly still quite beautiful. And someone next to him says that he continues to take care of the garden, and how when the factories closed, he was in charge of security, and then he became the caretaker when it closed. But he wanted to make sure the garden was all nice and pretty, because it was where the workers went to when on their lunch breaks and such, on nice days, and it was too beautiful to let it overgrow and have the weeds choke it. And so he made it stay that way, and hoping the factory would reopen soon. And Ferris says it looks like it will, and the man asks if Ferris is meant to be in the meeting room, and the man doesn't realise Ferris is Ferris, because of the clothes he's wearing match those of an Outlander. And he assumes that he's one of the scientists, and Ferris says that yes, but they locked the door, and the man holds the key card and says that he can sneak him in through the back. And he says, no sense riding up the Empire, not these days. And Ferris says he appreciates it, and he finally thinks that he's going to be able to learn something. So the man takes him over to the back of the room. He opens the door, the to the back of the room. He opens the door noiselessly. Tarkin and Vader, no one in the room, notice it, and Ferris sneaks in and he starts listening in. And it is Tarkin seeing how they'll have the technical resources of the Empire to assist them, and that if they need assistance or additional computers or resource materials, they can requisition them. And he says, on Balasa, the focus will be on new technologies for power conduits and modular components for artificial atmospheres on an unprecedented scale. And he says that they will divide into focus groups, and he says they will solve problems with new solutions, and they expect innovation and demand results. And he says that they have the honour of working on a project that will benefit the security and stability of the galaxy, blah 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 blah. And one of the scientists says, but what actually is the project? And another one says, how are we meant to work on this if we don't know the full picture? And Ferris feels the anger boiling in Vader. And Tarkin says, you received your instructions. I hope all of you are happy with the arrangements the Empire has made for your families. And that's when Ferris feels the room go from impatience and disdain into fear. And Ferris knows that the Empire are holding their families hostage. He just knows it. It doesn't need to be told. He just knows it. And the one that asked about what the project actually is asks if they'll be able to contact their families, and Tarkin says they'll be able to visit them if they work, as long as they're able to focus on their work. And he says that they must submit regular reports of their progress to Tarkin, to himself. And Tarkin then continues saying that all of this is being done to facilitate new strides in research and discovery. And he says you're privileged to be helping the Empire. And he says to bring in the press. Ferris hides behind a pillar as the press comes in, and he follows in at the back of them and goes and sits beside Tarkin and Vader. And he knows his little role. That's Vader and the Empire are using him for. He knows what he's expected to do. He's meant to be present in order to convince the Balasans that yielding to the Empire is, of course, going to be inevitable, and even for the so-called resistance heroes. And Tarkin starts his little speech. And we learn that he's the official spokesperson, and it says he's touting to the group as a think tank. It says he watched as Tarkin continued the official as the official spokesperson, touting the group as a think tank called the Balasan Project, and it says that this would hurtle Balasa into the future with advanced technological discoveries, all of which would benefit the planet. The scientist has agreed to take up residence on Balasa for an unknown amount of time. For an unspecified amount of time, out of their great desire to assist in this research and discovery, which is very ambitious. And one thing that made me laugh is Ferris's thoughts during this, because he thinks blah blah, which is an expression of Trevor's, and I find it really funny that he decided to go with a Trevor expression here. And then Tarkin indicates to Ferris, saying he's here to ease the transition, and Ferris is seething at this. He feels the great sense of revulsion, and he has to keep his face neutral because he doesn't want to give the expression that he's pleased about all this, but he also doesn't want to give people a reason to complain about Vader. Yet. And he doesn't want to give people to complain about Vader because, it's going to be him that ends up getting the punishment. And he knows he has to play the game. And now, not only does he have to find what Twilight is, which I actually had completely forgotten about until I was reading this chapter, he also had to find out what the real plans for Balasa are. and he wonders if the two things are linked, and he wonders why the scientists have been recruited. But then he's been taken over to the garrison back in the first book. If you remember, there was a garrison in the Commons in the first book. That's where Obi-Wan broke in and learned a Police Master. With that Malorum was just searching into Police Master, where also learns about Order 37. If you remember, I'm fairly sure that was it. Or was that in the clinic? I think it was in the clinic he learned about Order 37. I could be wrong on that. Or maybe it was the garrison. Yeah, I think I remember him breaking back into the garrison to after Ferrus. I think that's what it was. Yeah, it definitely was that, because I remember him getting the aid of Trevor to go in. Okay. But anyway, Ferrus is being taken back there, and he's been surrounded to make sure that he can't break off. And as he's walking down the stone walkway, the slate walkway, he sees splotches of paint. And he counts to 25 each time he sees a splotch of paint, and in between each, and after, once he finishes counting, there's another splotch of paint. And there's blue, then there's red, then there's yellow, and the officers are hurrying ahead. Ferrus is slowing down. He feels the stormtroopers behind him, which again are trying to stop him from breaking off. But he knows what this paint means. Ro needs to see him, and it's like it's just something ingrained in his head. Again, okay, I'll finish the summary now. I think we know. I think most of us know what the Larson project really is. I think most of us probably know. You know, it's like it's obvious. You know, it's the Death Star. And again, you've got to remember here that this isn't canon. You know, you got Rogue One in there in canon. You got I'm fairly sure, what was it? I think it was Project Stardust it was referred to as. I don't think it was ever referred to as Stardust in Legends, and Rogue One is not part of the Legends continuity. There is lots of I'm fairly sure there are multiple different things with the Death Star plans that happened. You know, I know Kyle Katarn's the most notable one, but I'm fairly sure there were other Death Star plan things that happened in Legends as well. But you know, I'm fairly sure we know that this is all being done as for research into the Death Star. I think that's, at least to us as a reader, that's a bit obvious. But you know, I think that's something where that's what it is, isn't it? We know what it is. What else is there? Again, I find it interesting that Ferrus is still struggling with attachments. You know, Obi-Wan had told him that attachments will be a strength of the new Jedi. If you remember at the end of the Desperate Mission, or something along the lines of that. He believes that attachment won't be a hindrance but a strength of the new Jedi. And it's brought up here, but it's interesting that Ferrus hasn't completely followed through on it yet, you know. He's still finding attachment difficult. He's still finding it how the Jedi have been right, you know, attachment makes it difficult to concentrate on the Force. To concentrate and work on your Force connection and keep that. And it's interesting how Ferrus is struggling with that. But you also see how he is somewhat starting to take on Obi-Wan's idea. He's figuring out ways to not let go of that attachment, but instead make it into a strength rather than a hindrance. And so it's going to be interesting to see over the course of this book and the next book how that will, and the next couple of books, sorry, how that will develop. What else? Again, I don't really have a whole lot to say on Tarkin's meeting. You know, it's like we kind of know what the Larson project is. It's Twilight that is the big thing that we need to figure out, I think. But just watching the Blossom Projects just isn't at all the Death Star, it's something else completely. But, you know, it's just, to me it feels like, yeah, it's got to be the Death Star, you know. Again, Twilight, that's going to be interesting to see what that is. Again, we have mentions of an operative before that, and now it's finally getting a move on, and that Vader has faith that's going to be successful. Now I'd express my curiosity as to whether it may be related to Flame, but again, because I've made it clear in previous reviews, I don't want to keep thinking about all of that with the spy stuff, honestly. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where all of this leads to. I have no idea where this book is headed, honestly. It could literally go to anything. So I have no idea where this book or the next couple books are headed. I know on the couple, I think it's on the couple of last books, at least, maybe, I know it's on Master of Deception at least, that he heads towards Alderaan, and that's something that's coming, but I don't know about the other books. I do not know, or this book even. And this is pretty much since the Tangled Web, I've been going into this blind. And even so, you know, Tangled Web and Return on the Dark Side made it pretty clear as to what the overarching story would be for those books themselves, you know. So even at the start of the books, you had a general idea of what the book would be about. Here, it's really we're over halfway through, and I'm still not entirely fully sure about everything that's going on, you know. So it's really keeping you in the dark. It's, again, what else is there to talk about? I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how Ferris gets out, because he knows Ro needs to speak with him. It's going to be interesting to see how he breaks off, finds Ro. So, yeah. And if he does speak with Ro, you know, it's going to be interesting to see if he lets him know that, no, I'm not with the Empire. I'm not with the Empire, but I'm still trying to find stuff out, and he tells him what he knows. But, you know, it's interesting to see where this is all leading to. I have no idea where this is leading to, and I think that's what is making this book so both fun, but also maybe not quite as engaging as the others. You know, I think at least I know Desperate Mission, all the previous books, they had some sort of storyline properly lined out for you to follow initially, you know. In Desperate Mission, you know, it was made very clear at the end of the first chapter what that book was going to be about. It's going to be about finding Ferris Solon. And through Dark Warning, we're constantly reminded that we need to stop the Lorum, and that's what Underworld and Death on Naboo were about. Then the Tangled Web, it was about solving the bug on Samaria. In Return of the Dark Side, it was about stopping Bogdavian from becoming ruler of Samaria and completely failing at that. You know, we had a rough idea of what was going to happen going into the book, and this is really the first time we haven't had an idea going into the book. All we really know is some vague mentions of Twilight. Ferris is on Belasa to sort out something with the factories, or something even he's not entirely sure what's going on. We got these mentions of a human male with kind of unusual powers, and that's Solace and Clive and Astri and Keats and Cohen and Dex are going to be investigating, so it's really interesting. Or we also got the mentions of, you know, Flame going to Belasa to fund an operation for the 11, which I assume will then lead to further funding. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where this is all leading, because it all feels at the moment very vague. And you know, we're halfway through the book now, over halfway, we're at halfway at the 74th page, point 5. At half of the 74th page. So, you know, it's... I have no idea where this is going. We pretty much have hardly any information as to where this is going, and that mystery, it's both really good, but it also feels like it's maybe not quite as engaging as the other books. Whereas, you know, we had an idea of where the plot was going in the other books. Even in like stuff like Darth Plagueis, you know, we had an idea of what that book was about. You know, it was about how the Sith rose into power. Or, you know, like evasive action, it's about surviving the Empire. Although evasive action, not necessarily, in my opinion, not necessarily the best of some of the Star Wars stories, but, well, you know, like the Dark Forces novelists, moving into Rebel Agents, you know, at that point, it's pretty much, the first book, you know, is about how Kyle joins the rebellion, not the Empire, sorry. And then the Rebel Agents and Jedi Knights are about just adapting the Dark Forces 2 game and stopping Jerick and the Valley of the Jedi, you know. We know what, a lot of the other stories, we know where this plot is going. Even in Master of the Jedi, for the most part, we knew where this story was going. Yet we don't necessarily know where this is going. So it's going to be quite interesting to see where this is headed. But yeah, I think that brings an end to this review. Again, I don't really have a whole lot to say on this. I didn't have a whole lot to say on this review, unfortunately, which is sad, which I find a bit sad, because this is quite a good chapter, but it's just not a whole lot to talk about with it, because a lot of it is, we kind of already know where some of it is going, but we also don't know a whole lot about where this is going. Usually the most intriguing parts are the stuff with the characters, so yeah. Unfortunately that's the case, but oh well, it is what it is. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye.